Hello, I am Eddie O'Sullivan, and this is This Week in the Second World War. This Week in the Second World War, brought to you by the International Second World War History Network. In 1939, on the 22nd of September, Lwów surrenders to the Red Army, and a German-Soviet military parade is held in Brest-Litovsk. On the 23rd of September, radios owned by Jews in the Third Reich are confiscated. On the 24th of September, Warsaw is bombed for the first time. On the 26th of September, the French Communist Party is banned in response to the Soviet invasion of Poland. On the 27th of September, the first Polish resistance movement, known as the Service for Poland's Victory, is created. The UK war budget raises income, inheritance and profit taxes and duties on alcohol, sugar and tobacco. The Reich Security Main Office is created under Heinrich Himmler. It is to be pivotal in the execution of the Holocaust. And on the 28th of September, the Warsaw garrison capitulates and the Soviet Estonian Mutual Assistance Treaty is signed in Moscow to allow the Soviets to establish naval and air bases within Estonia's borders. In 1940, on the 22nd of September, the Japanese invasion of French Indochina begins, and the RAF bombs Berlin. On the 23rd of September, Australian, British and French forces attack Dakar in French West Africa. The attack ends after 2 days with a Vichy French victory. In a radio address, King George VI says Britain will be victorious with the aid of our friends in the Americas. He announces the creation of the George Cross and George Medal, civilian awards for heroism. On the 24th of September, Vichy French air forces raid Gibraltar in retaliation for the attack on Dakar. On the 25th of September, all political parties in Norway are banned except for Vidkun Quisling's National Samling. On the 26th of September, the invasion of French Indochina ends with the achievement of Japanese objectives, and on the 27th of September, Germany, Italy and Japan sign the Tripartite Pact. In 1941, on the 22nd of September, Eleanor Roosevelt is appointed Assistant Director of the Office of Civilian Defence. On the 24th of September, at the Inter-Allied Council in London, representatives of the Soviet Union, Free France and the governments in exile of Belgium, Czechoslovakia, Greece, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland and Yugoslavia affirm the principles of the Atlantic Charter. That day, Yugoslav partisans capture Uzice in Serbia and make it capital of the mini-state known as the Republic of Uzice. On the 27th of September, Georges Catroux, the chief for Free French forces in the Levant, declares the independence of the Syrian Republic. Reinhard Heydrich is appointed Deputy Reich Protector of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and British commandos launch a raid on Saint-Aubin-de-Cannes in occupied France. On the 28th of September, an uprising begins in Drama in occupied Greece. It is brutally repressed in 2 days, and the first British convoy of supplies for the Soviet Union departs Iceland for Archangel. In 1942, on the 22nd of September, the Germans occupy the centre of Stalingrad. On the 23rd of September, British forces occupy Antananarivo, capital of Madagascar. Erwin Rommel leaves North Africa on sick leave and hands over command of the Africa Corps to George Stumer. On the 24th of September, German forces in Stalingrad break through to the Volga River and cut the Soviet 62nd Army in two. Japanese forces land on the Gilbert Islands. On the 25th of September, 4 British de Havilland Mosquito bombers carry out the Oslo Mosquito raid, which was intended to boost morale. In Norway, they failed to destroy the Gestapo headquarters, but caused 80 civilian casualties. On the 26th of September, the Manhattan Project is granted approval by the War Production Board to use the highest level of emergency procurement priority. And on the 28th of September, Stalin orders the resumption of the Soviet nuclear program, which had been dormant for a year.
Well, those are events, the main events, 1939, 1940, 1942, in the Second World War, in the third week of September. And there's a whole range of talking points, and we're trying to examine some of them. I'm going to bring in Joe Quinn, who's co-host with me on this project. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Eddie. How are you doing?
Very good. I'm in Northern Ireland, so I've been enjoying the sunshine, beautiful weather. I'll be going around Derry, going to Armagh tomorrow. So it's a lovely place to be when the sun is shining, and it's beautiful. So anyway, there you are. Those are some dates. I mean, just before we get into some of the subjects, the Polish, obviously, on the 17th of September 1939, the Soviets invaded, occupied the eastern part of the Republic of Poland, and this followed the invasion, the start of the invasion by the Third Reich. And one of the things about this operation is that neither the Soviet Union nor the Third Reich actually declared war against Poland. They both regarded it as a police operation. They never formally declared war. And the Soviet point of view, it's only 19 years. August 1920 is when the Red Army tried to capture Warsaw, and then afterwards ceded what is the area that they occupied in 1939, which today is Belarus and Ukraine. In fact, it's based the occupation line that was established between the Nazis and Stalin in October 1939 after the invasion is in fact the famous Curzon line, and it's called the Curzon line for a reason. It was named after the British Foreign Secretary in 1919 during the Versailles Treaty, who suggested this should be the eastern border of Poland and not what it became after the defeat of the Soviets in the 1920-21 war. So it's quite a complex story, but one with a lot of resonance. Any perspectives on it, Joe, you'd like to share?
Yes, well, I would say that first of all, the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939, just before the invasion of Poland, was it was an earth-shattering moment geopolitically, and it bespoke a whole variety of consequences for the world global order. It was seen as deeply threatening by the French and the British, and also upended their plans for a two-front strategy against Nazi Germany in the event of war. Now, it was very clear to Chamberlain as early as 1938 that the Soviet Union weren't exactly going to play ball in terms of, essentially what he was rather hoping for in the event that peacetime turned to wartime. There was also a deep distrust of the Soviet Union, and to a certain extent, the Western powers kind of let themselves down by not really engaging with the Soviet Union in order to bring pressure to bear upon Nazi Germany. And they could have done this quite successfully. Obviously, there was certain moral questions with regard to dealing with Stalin. And as a result of this, and as a result of their reluctance to deal with Moscow in a, shall we say, a sense that would have worked very much to their advantage, they decided to let that go by the wayside. And that left an opening for Nazi Germany to have a sort of a détente with the Soviet Union. And really and truly, the invasion of Poland would not really have been possible without Soviet acquiescence. The only way to reach this acquiescence, the only way that Ribbentrop could have successfully paved the way for a Nazi German invasion of the Soviet Union. And this was done for a variety of reasons, but primarily it was done in order to reunify the separated German territories from Greater Germany, as it was then known, with the Nazi German Reich, the Polish corridor and Danzig as well, and bring this all under, shall we say, the swastika of Nazi Germany. And because it was a potential threat to the Soviet Union, the big carrot that was offered to Stalin was territory, essentially have access, have the Baltics, and also have Eastern Poland. And really and truly, the fall of Warsaw at the end of September 1939, this week, 86 years ago? I'm just trying to remember. I'm not.
Yeah, 86 years ago.
Yeah. This is something which heralds the fall of Poland as a state. Really, it's really the moment that kind of marks the fall of the Republic of Poland to Soviet and Nazi forces. It's very apparent to everybody in the West that Poland will not be able to hold out. And there are some very interesting descriptions of what the fall of Warsaw was like when the last of the Polish soldiers that were resisting against the Nazi occupiers withdrew from the city. There was one particular Polish soldier who later infiltrated Auschwitz, who was on horseback riding through a deserted district in the Polish capital, and came across a German civilian wearing a very typically German hat and smoking a cigar very triumphantly. And he asked this German civilian where the German forces were. The German civilian responded with a very cheeky remark to the effect that at least we got rid of you Poles. And this Polish soldier hit him across the face and rode off and left the city. And that was really the end of that. That was the day that really resistance in the Polish capital came to an end.
Yes, exactly. Well, of course, the problem that Poland had, and it had from its creation in 1918, 11th of November is technically the date which is cited as the foundation of the Second Polish Republic, is that the Poles were a majority, but they were not a substantial majority. It was about 60% were Polish and Polish-speaking and Catholic. Yeah. And you have very substantial minorities of Ukrainians and Belarus, and of course a very substantial Jewish population who saw themselves wanting to integrate. And so all these issues all came to a head. And there's, in the area that was occupied by the Soviets, the majority of the people in that area were in fact not Polish and not Catholics. So there's a lot of complexity there. Obviously, I don't want to go into the gory detail too much because it was, and the irony of the whole matter is, of course, that in 1945, what happened is that the Soviet Union was allocated more or less exactly the land that it occupied in 1939. And Stalin was made a master of Europe, became a master of Europe. So it was a very perverse situation. So anyway, look, let's go forward to 1940. And a date that interests me is the attack on Dakar, which is a very peculiar moment in the Second World War history. Let me just explain why. First of all, for people who don't know what I'm talking about. So in 1940, before the French armistice, this was the French Empire. So you had the metropolitan France, which is the bit which we now know as France. Look at that area of Africa, which was under French control. Vast area, French West Africa. Then you had Madagascar, of course. You had that area, which is Syria, which was technically a mandate, but it was controlled by the French. And then you had French Indochina. So the French Empire in 1940, even after the defeat of the Nazis, was very substantial. And the French, the largest group of independent French soldiers was actually in the empire, particularly in North Africa, which is why there was quite a lot of effort made in 1940 and subsequently to try and change the allegiance at least. And what happened is the majority of the French Empire actually stayed with the Vichy French regime, which Britain did not recognize. Anyway, there's Dakar, which is now the capital of Senegal. And the reason why I find that quite an enjoyable story. So that picture there is Evelyn Waugh. Just him there with the pipe.
I do indeed. Yeah.
Born in 1900, I think. Yes. Or was it 1903? Anyway, classic English middle-class chap. He went to public school, Oxford, where he was one of the bright young things in the early 1920s to dance in the Charleston and living it up like in Brideshead Revisited. Curiously, in 1939, in 1940, he managed to enlist into the Royal Marine Commandos. Very unusual. And he served, he had a very distinguished war record. Now, after the war, he wrote a book, a trilogy, Sword of Honor. And the first book, the first novel, which it's probably my favorite Second World War book, Men at Arms, tells the story of his involvement with the Battle of Dakar, which was a bit of a fiasco for the British forces because they were only there for a couple of days. And the objective was basically take control of the garrison. And they were hoping the Free French Army would not fight, and they did. So that was a failure. And then, of course, there are other dates that we went through. We didn't mention Kabir, of course, the sinking of the French fleet by the British Navy in July 1940, which set the scene. And then basically Britain at this point didn't recognize the French government, didn't recognize an alternative government. He was trying to bring up Charles de Gaulle. And at the same time, they were trying to clip off parts of the French Empire. So Dakar was Congo-Brazzaville, which is further south, of course, appears in Casablanca famously as the place where Rick is going to go after he leaves Casablanca. He's going to go to Congo-Brazzaville, which is a free French enclave. Then Indochina, as we saw, was invaded by the Japanese before they even started the war against the United States and Britain. And that happened in September. And then the Madagascar, which was a French possession. Again, the British landed there with Australia, with mainly British and Indian British Army to take Madagascar. So what was happening until basically the French, the Allied landings in North Africa, when at last they managed to have territory, a real firm base in French imperial territory, and therefore could relocate the Free French headquarters. And then you had a government to do. But in this period, it's quite a lot of games and shenanigans were going on against the French Empire. People don't realize that in 1940, despite the defeat, the French Empire was very considerable, and any particular insights on that? I've got something wrong there, Joe.
Well, one of the things I would say about the, you have to remember that it was a very different world back then, and you had these, these global empires. Britain and France were very much transnational powers, and they had this massive global infrastructure, which you could barely imagine today, but it was everywhere. And when you served in the armed forces, in the UK armed forces, you were really serving in a global army, and you had, RAF bases and Royal Navy bases and army bases right throughout the world. And it was no different for the French, really. So you have this massive imperial apparatus still controlled by the French all over the world, which the British have to neutralize. But it's very important to remember that the conflict that takes place within Africa, it doesn't take on the same scale as what had occurred during the First World War, where you actually have continental wars. A continental war. You had the war in Europe, of course, during the First World War, and you had the war in the Middle East, but you also had an entire theater of operations taking place within Africa. It was the same during the Second World War, but to a certain extent, the British operations against French West Africa, or French-controlled West Africa, and also the French-controlled interior, the Sahara, Chad, and whatever like that, was rather limited. It didn't take on the same proportions as what had happened in the First World War, where you'd, sort of massive theaters of conflict taking place within the interior of Africa. That did not occur to the same extent, but you did have, it was very important, for instance, Nigeria, as a colony, basically as a British West Africa, was totally surrounded on all sides by French colonies. And you also had Sierra Leone as well, which was a very important strategic British enclave, naval facilities there. They're the most important naval facilities, arguably, in the whole of the African continent, outside of Egypt, Alexandria, and the facilities in South Africa. Sierra Leone was hugely important for British naval operations, particularly in the Battle of the Atlantic. And to be perfectly honest with you, even though you had a lot of Vichy-controlled territory, they didn't pose an immediate threat to these British enclaves. Certainly nothing that the British couldn't handle. And eventually, bit by bit, and a gradual strategy evolved to sort of take over or neutralize these territories. And then you also had defectors from the Vichy French over to the Free French side. There were lots of French forces that basically skipped the border and went into British-controlled territory. And I include with that the Free French that famously fought a siege action at Bir Hakeim in North Africa, which was one of the most famous battles that the Free French were involved in of the entire Second World War. And that was a battle done in cooperation with British forces, and was one of the first great examples of, during the Second World War, of successful liaison between the Free French and the British, which worked very much to their advantage and against the Nazi German and also Italian fascist forces. But I just also want to point out, Madagascar was invaded in 1942 by British and Commonwealth forces, particularly South African forces. South Africans played a key role in the amphibious landings in Madagascar and taking over that entire island. They encountered some resistance here and there, but largely the Free French forces on the island, largely they surrendered in droves. There was very little resistance compared to other areas where the Allied forces landed. And actually, it's very important to note that the 2nd Inniskilling Fusiliers, 2nd Battalion of the Inniskilling Fusiliers, took part in the invasion of Madagascar, and actually interviewed a veteran. He was a captain in an anti-tank, later an anti-tank unit of the 2nd Inniskillings, and later took part in the Sicilian and Italian campaigns, and eventually the 2nd Inniskillings, as you know, was folded into the Irish Brigade that took part in the Italian campaign, taking the place of the 6th Inniskillings because they'd suffered so many losses. So Billy Vincent described the invasion of Madagascar, and he described it as something like a holiday, and he remembers waking up in the veranda of a lovely French kind of colonial house and waking up basically, and he was looking down and he had some sort of very large gecko basically sleeping on his legs when he awoke early in the morning. To be perfectly honest with you, in terms of the Allied conquest of the French Empire, particularly in Africa, you don't really encounter many stories of very fierce resistance. And as the war goes on, the French become more and more, those who have collaborated with the Germans and are under the command of the Vichy regime, become more and more disillusioned with the course of the war and where things are going. And by late 1942-43, the writing is on the wall. It's very clear to all but a blind observer that the Allies are winning, they have the momentum, and that the Axis have reached the zenith of their power, and the nadir is not far behind. Very interesting, I must say. And it's very good that we're taking on board the global dimensions of how the war evolves.
Yeah, one of the things about Madagascar, there was a concern that the Japanese would take it, and there was actually a panic in the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, that the Japanese were going to put paratroopers on Bahrain. I mean, there was a genuine panic because the Indian Ocean, increasingly, I mean, the Japanese got to the Andaman Islands, and we'll deal with that in the next section. So anyway, look, Joe, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to move on to the next phase of our discussion, which is looking at 43, 44, and 45. And after this, we'll come back and have a further conversation. So,
governor of German-occupied Belarus is in 1943, on the 22nd of September, William Kuba, governor of German-occupied Belarus, is assassinated in Minsk. The Huon Peninsula campaign begins in New Guinea. On the 23rd of September, the Italian Social Republic is founded in Salo in northern Italy, with former Italian Premier Benito Mussolini as the head of state. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of Germany's Reich Office of Security, orders the deportation of Jews from Italy, Denmark, Hungary, and Romania. On the 25th of September, the Red Army recaptures Smolensk, leading to the total abandonment of occupied territory in the Soviet Union. The German armed forces ordered the removal from service of anyone classified as a Mischling of the first degree. That's a person who had two Jewish or otherwise non-Aryan grandparents. On the 26th of September, Major Herbert Kappler, the German SS chief in Rome, delivers a 36-hour ultimatum to the city's Jewish community, requiring payment of 50 kilos of gold, as well as 100 million Italian lire, to avoid the arrest and deportation of Rome's Jews. Pope Pius XII orders the Vatican Treasury to deliver some of the gold. And on that day, commandos and sailors carry out the Operation Jaywick raid on Japanese ships in Singapore. On the 27th of September, the Drysdale River Mission at Kalumburu in Western Australia is bombed. The 8th Army enters Foggia and occupies the surrounding airfields, and the 4 days of Naples uprising begins. On the 28th of September, following a warning from George Ferdinand Duckwitz, a German diplomat in Nazi-occupied Denmark, Danish residents start helping most of the nation's 8,000 Jews elude capture. Fishermen use their boats to ferry 7,200 people to Sweden. General Julius von Ritter, administrator in German-occupied France, is assassinated by the French resistance, and in occupied Luxembourg, the country is declared Judenrein, following the deportation of the last of the nation's 674 remaining Jewish citizens. In 1944, on the 22nd of September, Boulogne is captured by the 3rd Canadian Division. Units of the Red Army capture Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, and US troops capture the Giogio Pass on Italy's Gothic line. On the 23rd of September, the Red Army enters Hungary. On the 26th of September, the Battle of Arnhem ends after the evacuation of Allied positions east of the River Rhine, and in Caserta that day, the Greek government in exile and resistance groups agreed to cooperate. On the 27th of September, the Red Army and Yugoslav partisans enter Albania. On the 28th of September, the Red Army and Yugoslav partisans begin the Belgrade offensive. Winston Churchill tells the House of Commons that day that a Jewish brigade is to be formed, and the authorities in Slovakia arrest more than 1,500 Jews and destroy a secret operation to smuggle Jews out of the country. In 1945, on the 22nd of September, General Patton complains in an interview that he had never seen the necessity of the denazification program. On the 23rd of September, the Egyptian government demands British forces withdraw from the Sudan prior to its incorporation with Egypt. On the 24th of September, Japanese Emperor Hirohito says that he did not want to start the war and blames Hideki Tojo for the attack on Pearl Harbor. On the 25th of September, the Allied Commission declares the Nazi Party illegal. The following day, the Japanese garrison in the Andaman Islands surrenders. On the 27th of September, Hirohito meets General MacArthur in Tokyo, and the neorealist drama film Rome Open City is premiered in Italy. And on the 28th of September, anti-Dutch rioting breaks out in Indonesia, and China and Turkey ratify the UN Charter.
Yeah, so that's 1943, 1944, and 1945. There are a number of talking points that arise from that. Obviously, just going to observe 1943, you've got a number of things connected to Italy, which is the creation of the Italian Social Republic. I don't want to go into it, but we discussed Italy before. And then, of course, in September 1944, we mentioned the Fifth Army's captured the Giogio Pass. Now, if you've been in that part of Italy, the Giogio Pass is genuinely quite a thing to climb, and it's got this incredible U-bends all up to the top, and then you go over, and then you're in the Saturno River Valley. In fact, anybody who goes up on the Giogio Pass road is likely to get seasick going up those beds all the way to the top. So it's quite an impressive thing. But we're not going to talk about that too much. On those dates in 1943, 1944, Joe, any particular dates that catch your attention?
Well, the installation of Mussolini as the head of the Salo Republic One of the things I would note is that there was a slight change in his uniform when that occurred. I don't know whether he reverted to wearing a black uniform around that time, but I do know that his headgear changed because he was no longer really wearing the symbol of fascist Italy, the big eagle, and so on and so forth. He was wearing the fasce symbol. And this is quite interesting because at a digital collection day it wasn't actually a digital collection day, it was a promotional event held for their Finest Hour project that I worked on the University of Oxford, and you, Eddie, collaborated on during the course of the program. We actually had an individual named Nigel come to this particular festival. It was the IWM History Festival, the first one held, and he brought Mussolini's hat. Now, the story behind this. Now, I'm sorry to say that my project manager on the project didn't have the courage for us to use this as an item for publicity to promote the project, which was a great shame, probably because of its association with a fascist dictator, but so be it. But this particular hat was one that was traded by Nigel's uncle, who was a man named Fred, who served in the London Irish Rifles and was later transferred. He was with the London Irish Rifles, originally with the Royal Ulster Rifles, and served with the 38th Irish Brigade in Italy. And during an encounter with an Italian partisan in 1945, as the war was wrapping up, this partisan, he was trading basically captured German sidearms, Lugers, if you will. And in return, this particular partisan gave him a hat, and it was one of these fezzes that the Italian fascist bigwigs would wear. And this particular partisan said that this is the hat belonging to Benito Mussolini. Are
you absolutely sure it was?
This is the thing. This is the story. This is the whole point. This is one of the things that we did on the project. We took stories at source. We took them as they were given to us by members of the public. It was not our job to question the historical authenticity of the items concerned or whatever. It was very easy to verify most items, but this was a problematic item. We couldn't say for definite that it was Mussolini's hat, but the item was consistent with something that Mussolini would have worn. And the story goes that about a week before, Fred Long, with the London Irish Rifles, encountered this partisan. This particular partisan was a member of the party that apprehended Mussolini and his mistress as they were fleeing Milan. And they were taken out of the car and they were summarily executed by these partisans. And their bodies were brought back to Milan and they were strung up upside down. But this particular hat, according to this partisan, may belong to any number of fascist bigwigs, collaborators with the occupying Nazi forces, could have belonged to any one of those. But the partisan assured Fred Long, this rifleman in the London Irish Rifles, that this hat belonged to the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. And unless we get a DNA test done on the hat, we'll never really know the truth. But I thought it was an amazing story. And it makes me wonder about what Mussolini's final years as the head of this so-called Salo Republic, which was essentially not really a properly functioning, recognizable entity. It was just, shall we say, a quisling government, if you like, basically installed to give a little bit of legitimacy, a veneer of legitimacy to the German occupation of northern Italy. And really and truly what happened was Mussolini was, in essence, a prisoner within a palazzo somewhere, I can't remember exactly where, in the north of Italy, and didn't really get to do much and had no power. And beyond having a few customary visits to the Führer of the German Reich, Adolf Hitler, including during the day when Hitler had an assassination attempt in Rastenburg at the Wolf's Lair, Mussolini really was neither use nor ornament. Probably might be more accurate to say that he was more of an ornament, the only remnant of which we have today is this so-called Mussolini hat, which
Where is it now then?
2 years ago.
Yes,
It's still owned. It's still Nigel still has possession of this particular item, and I was thinking about getting him on the show in order to discuss the story behind it, because regardless of whether it's true, this is actually authentically Mussolini's hat, or whether it's not true, it's still a great story, and it's one of the things we need to bear in mind when it comes to family stories. Concerning the Second World War, there are stories that may be true or authentic, and there may be stories that may be not true. But these are the stories that were given to members of the descendants of the Second World War generation, and they're simply the bearers of these stories. We can verify the authenticity of these stories, but we're not really in a position to turn around and say, well, that guy's a liar, or this person is telling fibs or whatnot. The truth about it is, this is history as well, and it has to be captured. And it's for experts and historians at a later point to verify the authenticity of these items and of these stories. But I think it's more important to capture these stories at source, and then the investigations can happen at a later point. And one particular thing that I think would be fantastic to do is if Nigel was willing to cooperate with somebody's inquiries, it'd be brilliant to have a DNA test on hair follicles on that hat, which is, by the way, kept within plastic cellophane, a plastic bag, and possibly perform some sort of a DNA analysis on whoever.
Well, I think you'd have to get the cooperation of the Mussolini's family to get
Probably,
corroborated.
yes.
Probably the DNA will show that he could be the hair of at least 100 million people now.
Possibly.
But what a great story, and that's Mussolini's hut. I love this. Now, looking forward, looking at 1943 and 1944, there's some themes there, and we've got the process in which Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who was hanged, he was convicted at Nuremberg and hanged, who was head of the Reich Security Office. And then this is 1943. This is at this point that a different phase of the Holocaust is now being operated, because the one that we familiar with is the Holocaust by bullet, which is the Einsatzgruppen following the Wehrmacht and massacring hundreds of thousands of Jews, including the Jews of Kiev in Babi Yar, some often with local assistance, and that is unfortunately true in not just in Kiev, but also in Lithuania and elsewhere. And then you've got this period where Kaltenbrunner is now deliberately targeting, isn't he, the well-integrated Jewish populations of Western European countries. He's saying, I want the Jews of Italy and I want the Jews of France. And this process was going on. And of course, it included, as we saw, the Jews of Denmark. And then so you have this different approach has now been applied. And the objective was mass murder in the end. But then you had different responses. You had in France, the Vichy French regime cooperating. I didn't deal with it, but the Vichy French regime cooperating with the deportation of French citizens and others who weren't French citizens, who were Jewish, in their territory. And then you have the example of Denmark, where the overwhelming majority of Danish Jews are actually saved with the cooperation of the Danish people. So doesn't this shed light on the fact that the Holocaust, which is a long word and a terrible word, quite rightly applied to the mass murder of Jews of Europe, it took different forms at different stages. It was a process that went on right until the final months. And as I mentioned in Slovakia, Slovakia was a puppet state. I mean, it was the eastern bit of what had been Czechoslovakia. It had a kind of clerical fascist state, a bit like Croatia. And there you had a different story in which the Slovakian authorities were actually cooperating to a certain extent with the Nazis, again, and deporting their populations. So the Holocaust story, which is an impossible thing to deal with quickly or briefly, but I think it shows that this process of the Holocaust went through different stages, Joe, doesn't it?
It does, and also more horrifyingly, the priority in terms of the Holocaust, the French and German and Danish and Central and Eastern, Western European Jews, the Jews that lived within these particular countries, these Western power nations, were treated in some ways, ultimately, those who died ultimately met the same fate. But there was degrees of, dare I say, civility accorded to Western European Jews, which were not afforded to Eastern European Jews. And this very much conformed with the Nazi view that the peoples of the East were barbaric, Slavic, subhuman, this whole idea, and Jews were treated worse or met a more horrific fate the further east you went. Soviet Jews, Polish Jews, and so on and so forth. Slovakian Jews, you mentioned, they're among the first to be brought into Auschwitz. When Auschwitz gets really going as this concentrated site of mass murder, this murder factory, if you will. And one of the things I would say that happens really is within the East, you have the genocide of the European Jewish population, hand in hand, I should say, also with the genocide of Poles and with of Soviet citizens, Ukrainians and Russians, particularly Russian prisoners of war, and they all meet a slightly similar fate in the sense that, you know, you have Russian prisoners of war effectively been experimented on and horrifically butchered in sites such as Auschwitz and Majdanek alongside Jewish internees. But essentially, they're all viewed more or less the same way. They're all viewed as subhuman, various different categories of degradation of other human beings because of where they're from, because of perceptions of their, shall we say, genetic worthiness to exist, and also whether or not they're considered to be useful to a potential war effort, or whether they're considered under Nazi doctrine to be useless eaters, if you will. Western European Jews start to meet the same horrific barbaric fate as their Eastern counterparts from late 42, 43 onwards. You have German Jews being subjected to mass deportations, then the Jews of Holland, of the Netherlands and of Belgium, and then the French Jews as well, around 43, 44, mass deportations start taking place. And then eventually also they open up Vichy French Jews to the same sort of treatment. And Vichy France, for a time, it was a safe area for French Jews to live, and many French Jews fled into Vichy France because they were not necessarily subjected to the same regulations with regard to the rounding up and deportation of Jews. But then this changed when there was a regime change in Vichy France, and when actually the sovereignty, or the supposed sovereignty of Vichy France was violated, and when German forces moved in to directly administer this particular territory, with, of course, the help of French collaborators, including Francois Mitterrand and other famous figures in French politics who somehow escaped the butcher's knife when the war came to an end, despite their horrific crimes of collaboration. You have, and Pétain also bears a huge amount of responsibility for what happens to the Jews within Vichy.
I don't think anybody accused Mitterrand of actually actively collaborating with the Nazis with the deportation of the Jews. I don't think anybody has ever said that. Can I just make that clear if there's any lawyers out there?
Right.
Well, we can argue it. I don't know what the evidence is, but
there are varying different views on the whole Mitterrand question.
Yes, it was covered up. There's no question, and it was only came much later in his existence, which sheds a whole new light on his presidency. Moving ahead, the last point. I mean, again, I've taken 1945 after the end of the war. So technically speaking, you could argue the war in the Pacific ended on the 2nd of September when the Japanese surrendered in Tokyo Bay. But then you've got the aftermath, and then we got in this week in 1945, you have the first major demonstrations against Dutch rule in Dutch Indochina. Now, the Dutch Empire, East Indian Empire, is something that most people, if you ask them, wouldn't even know it existed. But basically, Java, which is the largest island in what is now Indonesia, was a Dutch territory, and the Dutch were there principally because of the oil. And Shell, the Shell Oil Company, was based on the Indonesian Dutch oil resources, and that's the reason, of course, why the Japanese invaded it. But the complexity there, isn't it? We'll come again and again in the Far East, is that the Japanese were reaching out to the nationalist movements in Indonesia and elsewhere. And in the Indian Army, the Indian National Army, I had a very interesting podcast with Paul Woodage, in which they had a historian of India. And 50,000 Indians taken prisoner in Singapore. The majority of them volunteered for the INA. 40,000, like 30 to 40,000 of them were actually volunteered to fight for the Japanese to liberate India. So there's a lot of complexity at work, isn't there, on the Far Eastern story, which takes us right through the 50s, 60s, 70s, right up to the present day.
Absolutely. I mean, what happens really in the aftermath of the fall of Java, the surrender of the Japanese, is you have a remobilization of the Dutch armed forces, and conscription is introduced within Holland or the Netherlands, and you have in the post-war period a deployment of these conscripts that are equipped actually with gear. Some of it is Dutch manufactured, but there's some stuff that's basically hand-me-down kit from the Americans, including helmets, I believe. And they send this force, I think a poorly trained, but definitely poorly prepared force to reoccupy the former Dutch territory, or what had been a Dutch territory taken over by the Japanese, and to reoccupy it and to pacify it, because they're aware that there are disturbances and there's insurgencies, and there's a slightly Islamic insurgency going on within that territory as well. So you have the openings of a sort of something very similar to an Islamic insurgency that the Americans had to contend with at the turn of the century in the southern Philippines. This particular part of the world is a predominantly Muslim population, one of the largest in the world. And you had growing calls for independence in the aftermath of the vacating of this territory by occupying Japanese forces. And these Dutch occupiers who were reoccupying the country in order to secure Dutch interests within the region, you mentioned the oil fields and also the oil refineries. There were these massive oil refineries that were set up within Indonesia, which was very oil-rich territory. And Japanese dropped paratroopers on these refineries to secure them from Dutch forces. They met with very little resistance. They were able to overwhelm the garrisons in Java very easily. And you also have other interests. You've got tobacco and coffee and other types of plantations on the island. But really, the Dutch get off to a very poor start in terms of re-administering this territory, what we now know as Indonesia. And after a couple of years of really battling it out, the Dutch have to withdraw. They're not really capable of defeating the insurgency that is there, and it becomes a horrifying quagmire, which they're ill-equipped to contend with. This really signals the end of the European empires. And bear in mind that the Dutch had a presence in this territory for probably about something more than 300 years. They were definitely present in this region a lot longer than the British and the French were. And it's sort of the loss of Indonesia ultimately to an independence movement it's a huge blow to Dutch global and imperial interests. They still managed to negotiate rights to basically to drill and to refine the oil as part of Royal Dutch Shell, and also they have interests in the Caribbean as well at Curacao as well. They also have oil generating assets there in the southern Caribbean. But really and truly, the Far East, the map of the Far East at the end of the Second World War really does begin to change. And it's very clear that a lot of these European powers, if they have any interest in retaining these territories, they're going to have to battle hard against these post-war independence movements. And what happens to the Dutch in Indonesia also will later, throughout the 1950s, happen to the French in Indochina as well.
Well, I was looking at the figures there. 4,000 Dutch soldiers died fighting between 45 and 49 against the independence movements. 49 when Indonesia declared independence. 4,000, that's a significant figure. Of course, the United French had their Indochina experience with Dien Bien Phu, in which they were defeated there. But Britain also had its problems, of course, in the Malaya insurgency, in the Malaya emergency that went on to the 1960s. And then, of course, you've got the knock-on consequences of what happened in East Africa, and on and on and on. We go right up to the present day. Look, Joe, I'm going to call halt today's discussion. As you can see, I mean, I'm very interested in the political ramifications of all these amazing events. You've got these incidents, you've got these events, but the politics around it, we still have resonance. So I'm very pleased that we've had this broad conversation, Joe. Thanks very much.
Before you go on, I just want to also mention the all-important point of where you are currently broadcasting from tonight. You're broadcasting from the very historic port of Derry, Londonderry, which was key in winning the Battle of the Atlantic. Do you have any words to say about that, Eddie, before we...
Oh, no, there's no question at all that Northern Ireland as a whole, not just Derry, but Northern Ireland as a whole, which was part of the United Kingdom, played a really critical part in the Allied victory, because obviously strategically the location of the industries that were here, they're very important for the British war industry. Then you had the ports that we used, Belfast, of course, but then the convoys, the air protection for the convoys, and then Northern Ireland was used as a major training base. Yes. So tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans came here and trained in this area, and their legacy is kind of forgotten. But they were here, and some of them went on to great distinction, both in the war and afterwards. So Northern Ireland, it's something which maybe the people of Northern Ireland need to celebrate a bit more, that Northern Ireland, all the people of Northern Ireland, regardless, all played a role either through the armed forces or, through the police force or whatever was there, security, but also through shipping, through the linen mills, through the manufacturing, and through the training facilities, even providing a cup of tea to an American who, on exercises, who would stop for a cup of tea, who was given a cup of tea for someone here. So anyway, we'll come back to that, Joe, and so close to your heart. So anyway, that's it for this week. I'm going to say goodbye to Joe. See ya. And just say a couple of words in closing. So as you've heard, this is the fourth episode of This Week in the Second World War. I hope you find it interesting. The approach we're taking is a little different from other Second World War YouTube programs. We're dealing with it chronologically. So if you're interested from a learning point of view, you can follow the dates each week. This is what happened this week in 39 to 45. And we examine some of the issues. We're going to be coming back in some detail. I'm very pleased that Joe's working with me, very distinguished academic historian, and researcher and archivist, and someone who's very much on top of the story of the Second World War. I bring to it my own personal enthusiasms, and I don't apologize for those either. So from everybody here, I'm going to say that's it for today. We'll be back next week with another episode of This Week in the Second World War. So until then, from everybody here, it's goodbye, good luck, and may God bless you all.